Death in tabletop role-playing games is often reduced to numbers, but in great tabletop role-playing games, death helps shape the narrative. Hi, my name is Vase. I'm the creator of Left for the Vultures, the role-playing game, and today we're going to be talking about death mechanics in tabletop role-playing games. A game's death mechanics should reinforce its tone, but it also should reinforce the stakes that are involved in playing that game, and it should have some sort of emotional impact. This video explores how some systems explore death, and we're going to talk about some of the positives and critique some of the negative impacts of their death mechanics. So the first group is the classic death model. This would be D&D and Pathfinder. So basically you have a pool of hit points, and then when you go down, you start making death saves. Both D&D and Pathfinder do that, although they handle them a little bit differently from each other. So you drop to 0 hit points and you fall unconscious, and then you start rolling d20s, making death saving throws. If you fail 3 times, you die. If you succeed 3 times, you stabilize, although you're still unconscious. Healing immediately revives you. Pathfinder adds negative hit point thresholds and the wounded condition, which the way it works is each time you go down, you are wounded, so now you basically count as if you failed a death saving throw. So each time that you go to 0 hit points, you are far more likely to actually have your character die. So it does add a little bit more stakes, but in the end, the system is very similar to the Dungeons & Dragons way of handling it. Now, the biggest critique that I have with this system, mostly with Dungeons & Dragons, not as much with Pathfinder, is that it's kind of predictable and way too forgiving. Resurrection is super common in Dungeons & Dragons. One of my biggest critiques of 5th edition. I like 5th edition, but man, it is so hard to kill a character, and I'm not the type of game master that goes out of his way to kill characters, but because it is so difficult, players know this, and the stakes of any kind of combat feel so low and insignificant. Characters take death kind of like as if they're eating candy, like, oh, I'll just drop to 0, no big deal. The cleric's going to heal you for 1d4, and you just keep popping back up and keep fighting. A lot of people homebrew the rules because a lot of people understand just how weak the system is. Some people use the Pathfinder method for their Dungeons & Dragons games. Some people do different things. But in the end, the official rules are what they are. And I think, unfortunately, it makes the game way too easy. There should be some stakes. If you're fighting a big dragon, the players themselves should feel a little bit of fear when confronting a massive enemy like that. And I don't think a lot of players do, because death is just so insignificant in Dungeons & Dragons. And even if you do die, resurrection is so common at the higher levels, it just becomes kind of a joke. So going all the way to the other end of the spectrum, we've got the brutal and unforgiving systems. Systems like Warhammer Roleplay, Mörk Borg, the Black Hack, and other OSR type games, Shadow Dark, that kind of stuff. So, for example, Warhammer Roleplaying, the way that works, characters suffer critical wounds once they're reduced to 0 wounds. So they start bleeding, dismemberment happens, death, depending on the type of hit. Permanent injury and mutilation are very common in this game. I like that. Healing doesn't erase the scars. I really like that. Warhammer is kind of more towards where I like it to be, although it's still a little bit too brutal for my liking. Mörk Borg, you have very low hit points, usually less than 10 hit points. Almost any hit can kill you in one swing. Death is very swift and frequent. Mörk Borg is more like a party game, and because of this, you never really make a character that you get attached to. So it definitely enforces the theme of the game. That's what the game is supposed to do, so I'm not critical of it in that sense. But as far as a long-term campaign or long-term gameplay, this is not a game where I'm going to make a character that I love, because they can die at any moment. And the Black Hack and other OSR systems, usually there's no death saving throws like in 5th edition. Basically, you're reduced to 0 hit points, and then you're dead. So this does encourage a little bit of creativity. Players tend to avoid combat. OSR systems tend to have a little bit more hit points and a little bit more of a damage threshold than, say, Mörk Borg, except at the lower levels, it tends to play out like Mörk Borg. But, if your character survives to higher levels, they're a little bit more survivable, although you always usually have to still be very careful. My critique of these type of brutal systems is they're way too unforgiving. Sometimes the luck of the dice is all it takes to kill your character, and there's nothing that you could have done. If your party is ambushed and surprised and the rolls don't go your way, your character's dead, and now you got to make a new character. So sometimes the systems are too brutal, maybe take it a little bit too far, in my opinion. So if I ever were to play Mörk Borg again, or Warhammer roleplay again, I've played those a couple times, I wouldn't make a character that I really devoted a lot of brain power to or put a lot of thought into a backstory into, because I may have to make a new one that same session or within a session or two. So yes, it forces you to play carefully, and I know some of you in the comments are going to say, well, I've been playing the same character for X number of years and they've never died, and I'm playing one of those systems. That's great. I'm glad that that's the case for you and that you get to enjoy your character. But what I'm saying is, you really can't plan for that to be the case every time. In fact, you should plan for your character to die, because that is more likely to happen than you playing that character for years. The third group is Death as Drama group. So this is like Fate Core and Blades in the Dark. So characters generally don't die arbitrarily. Instead, they suffer like consequences that are narrative, mild, moderate, severe, that kind of stuff. Death happens usually only when the narrative deems it appropriate. So it just helps to create a really good story. They can resist death in Blades in the Dark using like stress and trauma mechanics. Instead of dying, they might lose something, like take a permanent scar, become unplayable but not quite dead, so the character's still part of the story. It does support cinematic play, high stakes, storytelling, that kind of stuff. But also, it feels almost like cheating to me. So this is my critique of it. It, again, just like I said with the OSR and the more brutal systems, it works for these types of systems. These systems are narrative systems. They're meant to be more of kind of like a collaborative narrative type of game. And so it works. But if I'm playing a game, I want the stakes to feel real. And when everyone's kind of deciding, well, should my character die today? No, it feels like the stakes are low. Not quite as low as, say, Dungeons and Dragons, because you're still trying to fit it to the narrative, but it does still feel low to me. Fourth group, the secret group, which is meta around mortality. So like something like Ironsworn, where death is tied to the fiction. So characters die from extreme failure by breaking their vows, which is super cool, but it's also very meta. 10 Candles. 10 Candles is a horror game where everybody is going to die. Like everybody knows they're going to die. It just depends based on your gameplay, how you're going to die. So that kind of creates some interesting stories. There's some games where death can transform the characters. They can become undead or ghosts and things like that, but we're not going to talk about those. That's a little bit out of the scope of this video. Now, in some games, there are alternate forms of death. There are games where there's madness or insanity, or like petrification, possession, or permanent mind control, that kind of stuff. Usually, you get this type of thing in horror games like the madness mechanics in Call of Cthulhu, Delta Green. Petrification does occur in like Dungeons and Dragons and a couple of the OSR games. Those are ways to die where it's not tied to your character's hit points or health mechanics. It's kind of a different thing. But I just wanted to mention that that is another possibility for characters when they're involved in a game like those. So how do we handle death in Left for the Vultures? Well, when I created the game, I wanted the game to be brutal and to have stakes, but I also didn't want it to be too brutal like the OSR games or Warhammer or Mörk Borg. I wanted you to be able to get attached to your character, but kind of have a journey where your character becomes, rugged, scarred, and transformed throughout their career of adventuring, but not always die, with a single blow. So I wanted your character's final form at the end of a campaign to tell a story of what happened to them throughout their entire journey of vengeance. So in Left for the Vultures, your characters most certainly can die, and as you go down, it becomes more and more easy to actually permanently perish or go insane. But the way it works in Left for the Vultures is when you're reduced to 0 health or 0 mental health, you take a permanent injury or a mental scar, and then your mental health or physical health is permanently reduced. Each time you gain a scar or an injury, it becomes harder and harder. You lose more and more health each time from your maximum. Your character most certainly will die eventually if you're too careless, but the scars that you gain, they create a really interesting narrative, kind of how Warhammer does it, but not quite as extreme, I guess, in terms of mechanics. But with Left for the Vultures, every time you go down, because the game is centered around vengeance, your character, yes, they suffer some of their health or some of their mental health in damage permanently, but they gain something. They gain vengeance points and they gain grit, which makes them more powerful. So even though they are more easy to dispatch, they also become more brutal and more unforgiving in their methods when dealing with foes. So your character's kind of shifting the balance of power and fragility. And I think that's really cool. I think by the end, your character may be transformed even into a tyrant, let's say, that is just brutal and unforgiving, filled with vengeance and grit, but frail. So he needs to command his legions to do his bidding. Maybe your character doesn't become evil, and after they enact their vengeance and succeed in their quest, they're so broken by the end that, they just go and retire in an island somewhere in solitude. Or perhaps they become a great leader, but their physical and mental scars can be seen by everyone and almost kind of pushes people away a little bit. Because Left for the Vultures is more towards the grimdark style of roleplay, there's always going to be sort of a dark tinge to the final outcome of a character. I think it's really cool. I think it creates a lot more of an interesting narrative for the type of game that I'm designing, and I think the mechanics definitely help to tell the story of what this game actually is. So I do think that the better games use death to reflect the soul of their game. I think Warhammer does it great, Mörk Borg does it great. Again, I have my criticisms because I do like to get attached to characters, but I understand why they use the mechanics the way they do. It reinforces the way the game is supposed to be. The one that does it the weakest, I think, is 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. You do want to play heroic characters in D&D, but I think stakes should always be a part of that. So, unfortunately, I think they top the list as one of the bigger failures in their death mechanics. But that's not to say some people don't like it. Some people prefer to have a character that never dies, and that's the stories they want to tell, and that's great for them too. Anyways, that's been my take. I'm sure some of you will have some great takes on this. I'd love to read your opinions on it and have a discussion. Please leave the comments in the comment section down below, and I'd be happy to respond to them. Thank you guys very much. Again, my name is Vase from Left for the Vultures. I hope you have a great day.